There was a lot I was worried about with the release of Shadowbringers, mainly coming from the live preview that the development team presented about a month before the game's launch. A few too many times, certain wording was used along the lines of, "We're simplifying this," or "You'll no longer have to worry about that." One of the things I didn't really go over in my previous review of Final Fantasy XIV is that this isn't a very complicated or difficult game to begin with. It requires a fair bit of multitasking, some planning ahead, and boss fights can be very unforgiving, especially on the higher difficulties. However, for the most part, it's not the kind of game that demands a ton of skill, and it's pretty easy for most people to jump in and perform well with minimal effort. Although the skill ceiling can be a little high, you don't need to perform optimally to do well and complete the vast majority of the game's content. So hearing that the game was going to be further dumbed down sounded to me like the ship was sinking, that this was going to be the beginning of the end, and I might as well get ready to quit while I was ahead. Somehow, the absolute madmen pulled it off. Shadowbringers is another great expansion, pretty much on the same level as Heavensward. Some of the dungeons and boss fights introduced here, just at launch, are among the best so far. The story stands tall not just against the previous expansions, but as an RPG period. And the music. That's another thing I left out of the previous review. Final Fantasy XIV has some of the best music out of the entire franchise. But with Shadowbringers, Masayoshi Soken, the lead composer, has outdone himself. All of this almost makes Final Fantasy XIV worth getting into. If all the previous content wasn't such a barrier of entry, then I would love to give this a stronger recommendation. But focusing on this expansion specifically, if you're on the fence about continuing after Stormblood, then go for it. Shadowbringer should not let you down. That's not to say that it's perfect. I'm not totally happy with some of the gameplay changes, but for the most part, this is a really good expansion. Since this is such a story-heavy MMO, it's always important to examine what it has to offer in this regard. Our hero and the rest of the gang have been pulled into an alternate dimension, and one that's teetering on the brink of apocalypse due to an overabundance of the element of light, tipping the elements far out of balance. Should this country of Norvrant fall to calamity, then a ripple effect will be cast across the other dimensions and bring utter disaster to the Warrior of Light's home planet. Thus, the Justice League, or the Power Rangers, or whatever you prefer, have to track down the cause and reverse the effects before it's too late. That's a short summary, but there is plenty more to it, such as the cause of the Flood of Light and what it really means on a grander scale. It's a lot to take in, and it comes very far out of left field. At least with the Heavensward and Stormblood expansions, the nations of Ishgard, Alamigo, and Doma were hinted at constantly throughout the broader narratives. But Shadowbringers throws in dimension hopping a little out of nowhere. And believe me when I say that this stuff is tame compared to what comes later. I kid you not, there's a part where you're fighting eldritch horrors in the cosmos. I mean, I thought Midgard Somner's and Omega's backstories were pretty nutty, but the final area of Shadowbringers is completely unexpected. It comes very much out of nowhere. And yet, the story manages to weave everything together in a reasonable way. When there's so much going on at once, it can be easy to lose focus, and this would break the pacing of the story. I feel like that was a bit of a problem with Stormblood, as it split the story between Alamigo and Doma, but Shadowbringer simply uses an occasional meanwhile in order to give a brief glimpse at what's going on back home, and to no doubt hint at future expansions. A brief glimpse is the key phrase here, as these cutscenes are over just as soon as they begin, but are nonetheless filled with important exposition. Thus, the story stays focused on Norvrant, and all the better for how interesting of a land this is. Each of the previous expansions have had shared themes, with colonialism, revenge, rebellion, and warfare being very common ones. Shadowbringer stands out then for being very rooted in depression and hopelessness. There are moments of heavy contrast, most notably the adventure through the region of El Meg and the playful pixies and other oddball creatures, but for the most part, this is a really dark story. The filthy rich citizens of Yulmore live in absolute decadence, having accepted that the world is nearing apocalypse and have decided on wanting to live their lives in the comfort of blissful ignorance until the end. Elsewhere, scattered smaller villages fight a losing battle to hold on to their religions and their beliefs, and others still have all but entirely given up on their lives.
Being here with them, it beats going home. Home stopped being home when I lost them. I thought to try and drown my sorrows, but somehow the bottle's never deep enough.
No bottle is. Believe me, I know.
This kind of thing can easily come off as heavy-handed and pretentious, but I wouldn't say that that's the case here. Not everyone is so downtrodden, and their personalities usually aren't so two-dimensional. The villains in particular showcase a decent amount of depth, often rationalizing that there's no other logical path forward than what they propose. It's all about balancing the different moments and moods. You have your good times, and then you have the darker parts of the story.
Reinforcements are coming, remember? The captain said so. We're going to be all right.
Run! Run, damn you!
The Warrior of Darkness has returned. The Bloody Knight has returned. So stay with me, eh? You can't go dying now.
God damn it!
Please let this work. Please let this work. No. No, no. Stay back. Stay back.
Help! Help! Anyone! Why did you spare me? Why? What have I done to deserve this mercy?
Shadowbringers does a good job presenting both sides, it has interesting villains, and it all takes place in a new creative world. As for the gameplay changes of Shadowbringers, it's all over the place, and I don't think I agree with a lot of it, but I will concede and say that it does work for the most part. The most significant change has been the removal of TP, which was basically the character's stamina. It governed how many physical actions could be taken before the player would be exhausted. Now that physical actions can be taken for free, there are a lot of implications that make the game easier to handle and more forgiving as a whole. For starters, multi-target attacks are now stronger than ever. The TP meter used to govern this AoE spam, forcing the player to switch to single target attacks before overexerting themselves. There also used to be several abilities meant to regenerate TP, such as Goad and Invigorate, which can help extend the use of multi-target attacks when used properly. If a player is revived after being KO'd, then they either need to regenerate their own TP or hope that a teammate is able to do so. And if neither is the case, then the whole party suffers due to the subsequent drop in damage output. The TP meter alone added another layer to keep track of, which I would say is necessary because there's not a whole lot of difficulty in this game outside of multitasking and tunnel vision. But now that it's gone, half of the game has just become spamming AoE abilities, and dying is far more forgiving. This kind of design philosophy has been applied across the board. Tanks can build enmity easier than ever, ensuring that monsters will never attack anyone else. The Monk job has lost a few moves to help streamline its playstyle a little more, and Scholar and Summoner were severely gutted. You can no longer directly command your pets, such as using the Scholar's Embrace spell for a super efficient and constant healing. This used to be such a cool aspect of those jobs, but I guess it was deemed too complex, and now the pet's simple abilities are automated, while their more complex ones are simply new moves for the Scholar. Scholar also lost Miasma, Bane, and almost lost Energy Drain before they recently brought it back. Now, this isn't to say that every job has been ruined. White Mage got a few new moves that I think are really cool, and while I'm not happy about Astrologian and Machinist having their old playstyles just about completely scrapped, I will say that the new stuff they have works out pretty well for them. Dancer and Gunbreaker are also great new additions to the game, and each of them breathe some nice variety. Dancer being an alternative to Bard and Machinist, offering constant attacks at range, but with even more random activations than what Bard has, plus some pretty good party-wide support abilities. Gunbreaker is far more combo heavy in comparison to the other tanks, going so far that it could be considered a light DPS of sorts. However, to compensate, they also have a lot less resource management, only being a 2-point system as opposed to a whole meter. In my opinion, Scholar and Summoner were practically ruined. However, this doesn't mean that they're not viable or worth playing anymore. Even with the changes, they're still fine jobs with unique playstyles, and there are still plenty of other jobs to choose from as well. So every player is bound to find at least a couple that they can really gel with. And, as usual, Black Mage is still the best job in the game. The bosses and dungeons are more of the same for the most part, but they're still doing a good job with throwing new tricks at the player to keep them on their toes. There's a new interrupt mechanic too, where the game points out attacks that you're really going to want to prevent from going off. It's not going to ruin you if you don't interrupt the attack in time, but it is pretty satisfying when you do pull it off. It's a real simple and small addition, but again, adding more multitasking is good because there's not a whole lot else to the game. This rotating AoE that they introduced in Stormblood gets a lot of mileage in these dungeons, to the point where it's hardly special anymore. However, each boss's version is just different enough that you do need to pay attention to what's going on. And I don't know what's up with the design of this rejected Kingdom Hearts monster, but now I'm just poking fun at goofy stuff. If you've enjoyed the dungeons of the previous expansions, then rest assured the quality has continued to remain intact. I was worried that oversimplifying the available moves and removing TP was going to casualize this game by a lot, but in practice, it doesn't feel like that much has actually changed. It is easier to fulfill your individual roles, but there are also way more attacks to avoid and look out for. In that aspect, it does balance itself out fairly well, but I still have this nagging feeling that the game has been dumbed down, if at least by a little. Regardless, it's still fun. So yeah, recommendation? If you've been keeping up with Final Fantasy XIV all the way so far, then do not stop now. Shadowbringers is a definite high point for the series, and the new Eden raid is pretty sweet too. If you're jumping into the game brand new, then it's fine as long as you're really patient with it. I went over this in the previous review, but the story has a really slow start. Once it finally ramps up, then it's really enjoyable, but it's not the kind of game that you should be rushing through. If you turn it into a chore, then you're likely going to end up hating it. But all these aspects are at odds with each other for a game that you're paying $12 a month for, on top of the initial cost of buying the game itself. For that reason, I'd say don't bother, but that's more of my opinion on MMOs in general. If you are interested in it and you do want to play an MMO, then Final Fantasy XIV hasn't shown any signs of a severe downhill trend just yet. The next expansion will inevitably release in 2 years, and who knows what changes we'll end up getting with that. But for the time being, I'd say Final Fantasy XIV as a whole is a pretty safe bet. Thanks for watching my review on Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers.